The hotel manager took one look at the woman in the mustard yellow coat and silently decided she didn't belong there. 10 minutes later, he would realize the entire lobby had just watched him humiliate one of the most powerful people connected to the hotel. Snow clung to Delilah Boone's boots as she stepped through the revolving glass doors of the Ashcroft Grand Hotel carrying 2 white bakery boxes tied carefully with red string. Warm golden light spilled across the marble floor beneath her feet while a pianist played softly near the bar lounge upstairs. Around her, wealthy guests moved through the lobby in black coats, silk scarves, and tailored suits, their polished shoes clicking against the stone in steady rhythm. Delilah paused near the entrance, brushing melting snow from her sleeve with one gloved hand. Her curly salt and pepper hair looked slightly flattened from the weather, and the knitted scarf around her neck had clearly been handmade years ago. She didn't notice the first stare. But she noticed the second. Then the third. The front desk receptionist glanced at her bakery boxes before quickly looking away. A couple near the fireplace lowered their voices the moment she passed them. Delilah kept walking anyway, calm and unhurried, until a sharp voice cut cleanly across the lobby. "Ma'am." Hotel manager Grant Ellis approached with the controlled smile of a man trained never to appear rude in public. His navy suit was immaculate. Silver cufflinks caught the chandelier light as he stopped directly in front of her, eyes drifting down toward the wet salt stains on her boots. Deliveries used the service entrance around the back. The pianist upstairs continued playing, but several nearby guests had already started watching. Delilah blinked once. "I'm not making a delivery." Grant's smile tightened almost invisibly. "Of course." His eyes moved to the bakery boxes again. "Are you here for an event?" "No, do you have a reservation?" "Not tonight." A faint silence settled between them. One of the guests near the fireplace smirked behind a champagne glass. Delilah adjusted the boxes gently in her arms. "I'm meeting someone upstairs." Grant nodded slowly. Though the expression on his face made it clear he didn't believe her. "The rooftop lounge is restricted to penthouse guests and members only." He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound polite while making sure everyone nearby could still hear. "We do try to maintain a certain atmosphere here." Delilah's eyes softened, not angry, not embarrassed, just tired in a way that somehow made the moment worse. "I know exactly what kind of atmosphere this place used to have." Something about the sentence made Grant hesitate for half a second. But then a younger couple entered the lobby behind her wearing designer coats, and his attention snapped back into performance mode. "I'm going to ask you one more time, ma'am," he said, now firmer, "please use the appropriate entrance for staff and vendors." A quiet murmur moved through the lobby. Delilah looked around slowly at the marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the velvet staircase she hadn't seen in nearly 8 years. Then she glanced back at Grant Ellis and gave the smallest nod imaginable. "That's disappointing," she said softly. "This used to be a Kinder hotel." The sentence landed strangely hard. Even the receptionist looked uncomfortable now. Grant forced a short laugh. "Well, the Ashcroft Grand has evolved quite a bit since then." Delilah looked at him for another long second. Then her eyes drifted past him toward the private black elevator hidden behind the far hallway near the concierge desk. And for the first time since she entered the building, something unreadable moved across her face. Recognition. Grant Ellis followed her line of sight toward the private elevator at the end of the hallway and immediately stepped sideways, subtly blocking the view as if the hallway itself were off limits. "That area is restricted," he said smoothly. "Guests without executive clearance are not permitted beyond the concierge wing." Delilah looked back at him slowly. "Executive clearance," she repeated softly, almost to herself. A young bellman nearby shifted awkwardly, recognizing something strange in her tone. It was not confusion. It sounded more like memory. Grant noticed the hesitation from his staff and straightened immediately. "Perhaps I can call a taxi for you," he offered, the fake warmth returning to his voice. The weather is getting worse outside. Snow pressed harder now against the giant front windows of the hotel. A gust of wind rattled the revolving door as another group of wealthy guests entered, laughing loudly in designer winter coats. They barely glanced at Delilah before following a hostess toward the restaurant staircase. Invisible. That was what Grant expected her to feel. Delilah lowered the bakery boxes carefully onto a nearby marble table beneath an arrangement of white orchids. "These need to stay upright," she said gently. "The frosting shifts easily." Grant stared at the boxes with growing irritation. "Ma'am, I cannot allow random food items to remain in the lobby." "Random," Delilah repeated quietly. Her fingers rested against the red string tied around the boxes. "Chocolate bourbon pecan for the night manager. Lemon cream for the piano bar upstairs. Carrot cake for Luis because he always hated chocolate." The nearby receptionist looked up instantly at the name. Luis Mendoza had worked security at the Ashcroft for nearly 30 years. "How do you know Luis?" she asked before she could stop herself. Delilah gave the smallest smile. "He used to sneak extra coffee to my kitchen every Christmas Eve." The receptionist frowned in confusion. Grant's expression hardened again. Enough. His polished composure was beginning to crack beneath the surface. "I do not know what kind of misunderstanding brought you here tonight, but this is a private property." Delilah looked at him carefully now, and for the first time, there was sadness in her face instead of patience. "You have worked here 6 years? Grant blinked. 7. Then you came after the renovation." "Yes," he answered cautiously. "I helped modernize this hotel." Delilah nodded once, her eyes drifting across the lobby again. The giant chandelier. The black marble columns. The gold-trimmed concierge desk. "You modernized it," she murmured. "That explains a lot." A few nearby guests exchanged looks. The tension had shifted now. At first it had felt amusing. Now it felt uncomfortable. Like everyone was suddenly afraid they had missed something important. Grant sensed it too. "Security," he called sharply toward the desk. The word echoed farther than he intended. Conversations near the fireplace softened almost immediately. A younger security guard approached from the hallway, tall and nervous, one hand lightly touching the radio on his jacket. "Sir?" Grant gestured toward Delilah without looking directly at her anymore. "Please escort this woman to the service exit." The young guard nodded automatically and stepped forward. Delilah did not move. She simply picked up the bakery boxes again with careful hands. "I would rather not leave yet," she said calmly. "Someone upstairs is expecting me." "No one upstairs knows who you are," Grant replied coldly. Then, from somewhere behind the concierge desk, an older voice suddenly cut through the lobby. "That is where you are wrong." The room went silent. The older voice came from behind the concierge desk, steady and unmistakably angry. Heads turned as a gray-haired man in a dark security blazer stepped into the lobby light. Luis Mendoza moved slower than he once had, but the second he saw Delilah standing there holding bakery boxes in both hands, his entire expression changed. "Miss Boone," he said quietly. The young security guard froze in place. Grant Ellis looked caught between confusion and irritation. "Luis," he said sharply, forcing a laugh, "do you know this woman?" Luis did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed on Delilah for another second, taking in the snow on her coat sleeves and the damp scarf around her neck. Then he noticed where she was standing. In the middle of the lobby. Surrounded by staring guests. His jaw tightened. "You kept her waiting?" he asked. The temperature of the room seemed to shift instantly. Grant folded his hands in front of him. "There appears to be some misunderstanding." "No," Luis replied. "There really is not." The pianist upstairs had stopped playing entirely now. Delilah offered Louise a tired smile and lifted one of the bakery boxes slightly. "I brought your carrot cake." Louise let out a soft breath that almost sounded emotional. "You still remember? You complained about the chocolate one for 12 straight years." A nervous laugh escaped from the receptionist before she quickly covered her mouth. Grant noticed every pair of eyes drifting away from him now and toward Delilah instead. The control he enjoyed moments earlier was slipping fast. "Louise," he said more firmly, "if this guest has a reservation issue, we can resolve it professionally." Louise looked at him with open disbelief. "Guest?" he repeated. "You thought she was a guest?" Grant hesitated. That was the first moment real uncertainty entered his face. Delilah looked down at the bakery boxes quietly, almost wishing the moment would pass without becoming bigger. But the silence inside the lobby had already become too heavy. Too many people were watching now. The young security guard lowered his hand from his radio. A valet near the entrance whispered something under his breath. Even the couple by the fireplace no longer looked amused. They looked uncomfortable. Louise stepped closer to Delilah. "I heard you stopped coming after the renovation," he said softly. "I heard the hotel stopped tasting the same," she replied. Grant stared between them. "Someone mind explaining what exactly is happening here?" Louise slowly turned toward him. "You know the private elevator upstairs?" Grant nodded cautiously. "Only ownership and executive board members have access." "Correct," Louise said. "And before you arrived here with your imported marble and celebrity cocktail menus, there was one person in this city who could walk through those doors any hour of the night without asking permission." Grant's face began to pale slightly. Delilah sighed under her breath. "Louise." But he kept going. "When this hotel nearly collapsed after the winter kitchen fire 9 years ago, she fed half the staff for free out of her bakery for almost 4 months. The receptionist blinked hard. "Boone's Bakery?" she whispered. Several employees recognized the name immediately. Delilah finally looked embarrassed now, not by the humiliation earlier, but by the attention. "It was just soup and bread," she murmured. "It kept people working," Louise corrected. "And when the investors pulled out, she was the one who stepped in quietly and saved the place." Grant's lips parted slightly. "That is impossible." Louise stared directly at him. "You have been insulting one of the hotel's largest shareholders for the last 15 minutes. The room went completely silent. Grant Ellis felt every eye in the lobby settle on him at once. A moment earlier, he had been the one controlling the room. Now even the sound of the snow against the windows seemed louder than his breathing. "Shareholder," he repeated carefully, as though saying the word slower might somehow change its meaning. Delilah immediately shook her head, uncomfortable with where the conversation was going. "Louise, please." But Louise had already crossed the point of silence. "No," he said firmly. "Not tonight." His voice carried through the marble lobby with surprising strength. "I watched this woman keep this hotel alive when nobody else wanted to touch it." Grant swallowed hard. "There must be some mistake in the records. I know the ownership structure." "Do you?" Louise asked quietly. The receptionist stared at her computer screen, suddenly typing faster than before. A few seconds later her face lost all color. She looked up at Grant with visible panic. "Sir," Grant turned sharply. "What?" Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Delilah Boone is listed under the Original Preservation Trust." The room shifted again. Several guests who had been pretending not to listen now openly stared. Delilah looked exhausted by all of it. She gently brushed melted snow from one of the bakery boxes with her thumb. "I never wanted my name attached to things," she said softly. That was the whole point. Grant forced a strained smile that no longer looked natural. "Miss Boone, if there has been any misunderstanding this evening, I assure you, you told her to use the service entrance," the young security guard interrupted before he could stop himself. The silence afterward felt dangerous. Grant slowly turned toward the guard, stunned that one of his own employees had spoken against him publicly. But the young man immediately looked down, embarrassed. Delilah noticed the fear on his face and stepped in gently. He was only doing what he was told. The sentence somehow made Grant look even worse. Because she was protecting the very people who had humiliated her. Luis folded his arms. "You know what the old owners used to say about her?" Grant said nothing. "They said this hotel had two hearts. The boiler room in winter and Delilah Boone's bakery during Christmas." Delilah gave a quiet sigh. "That was a very long time ago." "Not for the people who remember," Luis replied. Upstairs, the piano music finally resumed, softer now, almost cautious. Somewhere near the restaurant staircase, a waiter whispered Delilah's name to another employee. Recognition spread slowly through the building like heat returning to frozen pipes. Grant noticed it happening in real time. Staff members changing posture. Bellmen standing straighter. Faces shifting from confusion to realization. The power in the room was moving away from him with every passing second. He tried once more to recover control. "Miss Boone," he said carefully, "please allow me to personally escort you upstairs." Delilah studied him for a long moment. Then her eyes drifted again toward the private black elevator hidden beyond the concierge hallway. "No," she said softly. "I think I would rather use the old entrance." Luis immediately reached into his coat pocket. And when the small brass elevator key appeared in his hand, the entire lobby seemed to stop breathing. The brass key looked almost ordinary in Luis Mendoza's weathered hand, but the second it caught the chandelier light, something invisible changed across the entire lobby. Employees who had only heard rumors about the private elevator suddenly stood completely still. Even the guests sensed they were witnessing something they were never meant to see. Delilah's eyes lingered on the key for a moment before she gave Luis a tired smile. "You still carry it?" Luis looked almost offended. "Of course I do." Grant Ellis stared at the small piece of brass like it personally threatened him. "That elevator system was replaced during renovation," he said quickly. "Only executive access cards work now." Luis did not even look at him. "Not for this elevator." The older security chief stepped past the concierge desk toward the dark hallway leading to the private lift. Delilah picked up the bakery boxes again and quietly followed him. Nobody stopped her this time. Nobody dared. The young receptionist rose halfway from her chair as Delilah passed, suddenly nervous. "Miss Boone?" Delilah paused gently. "Yes?" The receptionist swallowed hard. "I am sorry." The apology was small and genuine. Delilah's expression softened immediately. "You were kind enough not to laugh," she said. "That already puts you ahead of most people tonight." The young woman looked close to tears after hearing that. Grant noticed several employees glance at him afterward, and for the first time since becoming manager of the Ashcroft Grand, he felt something unfamiliar creeping into the room around him. Disapproval. Not from ownership. Not from executives. From his own staff. The private hallway seemed quieter than the rest of the hotel, wrapped in dark walnut walls and soft amber lighting untouched by the renovation. Delilah moved slowly beside Luis, her boots making soft sounds against the carpet runner. "It still smells the same down here," she murmured. Luis smiled faintly. "Old cedar and coffee. And burnt cinnamon. From your bakery deliveries every December." A shadow of warmth crossed Delilah's face for the first time all evening. Behind them, Grant followed several steps back, unable to stop himself now. His carefully controlled image was unraveling piece by piece, replaced by visible anxiety. "Miss Boone," he called cautiously. "I truly did not realize who you were." Delilah stopped walking. For a second, nobody moved. The soft piano upstairs drifted faintly through the ceiling vents. She turned toward him slowly, the bakery boxes still resting in her arms. "That is exactly the problem," she said quietly. Grant opened his mouth, but no words came out. Delilah's voice remained calm, almost gentle, which somehow made every sentence land harder. "You saw an older woman carrying bakery boxes in a winter coat and immediately decided what kind of respect she deserved." The hallway fell silent again. "The hotel used to train people differently," she continued. "Back then, the first rule was simple. Every guest mattered before you knew whether they were important." Luis lowered his eyes slightly after hearing that. Because he remembered. Grant's face had gone pale under the warm hallway lights. "I never intended to humiliate you," he said softly. Delilah looked at him for a long moment, sadness settling into her features more than anger. "That is the dangerous part," she replied. "You did it naturally." Then Luis inserted the brass key into the hidden panel beside the elevator doors. A quiet mechanical click echoed through the hallway. And slowly, with a low golden glow spilling across the carpet, the private elevator doors began to open. Warm golden light spilled from the private elevator as the doors slid fully open, revealing polished walnut walls and brass railings untouched by the modern renovation outside. The small space looked less like part of the hotel and more like a preserved memory sealed away from time. Delilah stood quietly before it, the glow reflecting softly against the snow still melting on her boots. Nobody spoke. Not Luis. Not the receptionist lingering nervously at the end of the hallway. Certainly not Grant Ellis, who now looked like a man realizing his entire understanding of the building around him had been incomplete. Delilah stepped toward the elevator slowly, then paused before entering. "Is the rooftop still using the old piano?" she asked Luis. His expression softened immediately. "They restored it last year." "The black one from Chicago?" "Same scratches on the side and everything." For the first time that night, Delilah smiled without sadness behind it. "Good," she whispered. "That piano deserved better than storage." Grant stared at her carefully now, piecing together fragments of stories he had apparently never bothered to learn. The woman he had dismissed as a delivery worker knew details about the hotel that even senior management did not discuss anymore. Not because she researched them. Because she had lived them. "Miss Boone," he said quietly, almost cautiously now, "why did nobody tell me you were part of ownership?" Delilah looked back at him. "Because I asked them not to." The answer landed harder than anything else she had said all evening. Grant frowned slightly. "But why?" She adjusted the bakery boxes in her arms. "Because once people know you have power, they stop showing you who they really are." The hallway fell silent again. Luis lowered his eyes slightly after hearing it, as though the sentence carried more truth than anyone wanted to admit. Delilah continued softly. "I liked coming here anonymously sometimes. Coffee in the piano bar. Soup during winter. Watching the staff work during the holidays." Her eyes drifted toward the lobby behind them. "It used to remind me of what this place was built to be." Grant swallowed hard. "And what was that?" Delilah looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Warm." Somewhere beyond the hallway, laughter echoed faintly from the restaurant upstairs, but down here the atmosphere had completely changed. The luxury of the Ashcrofts suddenly felt smaller beside the quiet dignity standing in front of them. Delilah stepped into the elevator at last. Luis reached forward and gently pressed the brass button panel beside the door. The old mechanism hummed softly to life. Before the doors closed, Delilah looked once more at Grant Ellis. He stood rigid beneath the amber lights, his expensive suit suddenly meaningless against the weight of the moment. "People can forget policies," she said calmly. "They can forget names. But they never forget how humiliation feels." Grant lowered his eyes immediately. Delilah's voice softened slightly after seeing it. Do not build a hotel where ordinary people feel unwelcome. Because one day you may discover the person you dismissed helped build the place itself. The elevator doors began sliding shut. The last thing visible was Delilah standing quietly beside her bakery boxes under the warm golden light, looking less like an owner than someone carrying home into a building that had nearly forgotten what home felt like. Then the doors closed completely. And for several long seconds afterward, nobody in the hallway moved at all. The private elevator rose in near silence, the old machinery humming softly beneath Delilah's feet as warm amber lights reflected against the brass railings around her. She stood alone inside the small elevator holding the bakery boxes carefully against her coat while snow continued melting from the edges of her scarf. For the first time that evening, nobody was staring at her. Nobody was judging her clothes. Nobody was deciding whether she belonged. The quiet almost felt unfamiliar. Delilah looked at her faint reflection in the polished brass wall and exhaled slowly. 8 years. 8 years since she had last used this elevator. Back then the Ashcroft still smelled like cedarwood and fresh coffee after midnight. Musicians used to linger near the rooftop piano until 2 in the morning while exhausted kitchen staff shared soup downstairs between shifts. It had never been the fanciest hotel in Manhattan. But people remembered how it made them feel. That mattered more to her than marble floors ever could. The elevator doors opened onto the rooftop level with a soft chime. Warm jazz floated through the air immediately, mingling with the scent of bourbon, polished wood, and winter fireplaces. Conversations filled the rooftop lounge in low elegant murmurs beneath hanging golden lights. But the second Delilah stepped out carrying the bakery boxes, the hostess near the entrance froze completely. "Miss Boone," she whispered. Within seconds, recognition spread across the room in waves. An older bartender nearly dropped a glass towel. A piano player stopped halfway through a note before breaking into a stunned smile. "No way," he breathed softly. Delilah laughed quietly for the first time all evening. "You still play too slowly during the second chorus, Marcus." The pianist shook his head in disbelief. "You disappear for almost a decade and that is your first sentence? Some things should remain consistent." A few nearby guests looked confused, sensing something important happening around them without understanding why. But the staff knew. Every older employee in the rooftop lounge suddenly moved differently around her. Not fearful. Grateful. The bartender hurried around the counter immediately. "Miss Boone, let me take those." "Careful," she warned gently as she handed over the bakery boxes. "Luis gets emotional if somebody ruins his carrot cake." Laughter rippled softly through the lounge, warm and genuine. The atmosphere changed completely within seconds. Delilah was no longer an outsider standing awkwardly in luxury. She was somehow the emotional center of the room itself. Then a deep voice called from near the fireplace seating area. "Well, I will be damned." Delilah turned slowly and smiled the moment she saw him. Arthur Bennett rose carefully from an armchair near the windows overlooking the snowy Manhattan skyline. At 73, the founder of Bennett Hospitality still carried himself with quiet authority despite the silver cane resting beside him. Several younger executives seated nearby looked stunned as he crossed the lounge personally toward Delilah Boone. "You finally came back," Arthur said softly. Delilah's expression softened immediately. "You still owe me $20 from 2014. Arthur laughed loud enough to turn every head in the lounge. "I knew you would remember that." Then his eyes drifted briefly toward the elevator doors behind her. "I heard there was trouble downstairs." Delilah glanced toward the city lights outside the windows before answering. "Not trouble," she said quietly. "Just a reminder." Arthur studied her face carefully, already understanding more than she needed to say. The room around them had gone strangely still now. Because everyone present realized something important at the same time. Delilah Boone did not walk into the Ashcroft Grand like ownership. She walked into it like memory. Arthur Bennett guided Delilah toward the fireplace seating area while conversations around the rooftop lounge slowly resumed in hushed tones. But the energy had changed completely now. Executives who moments earlier had barely noticed the woman in the winter coat were suddenly standing as she passed. Staff members smiled at her with genuine warmth instead of polished hospitality. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Delilah lowered herself carefully into the leather armchair beside the fire while Arthur settled across from her with his cane resting nearby. "You disappeared on us," he said gently. Delilah looked toward the snow, drifting beyond the rooftop windows. "The city became louder," she replied. "My bakery stayed quiet." Arthur smiled faintly. "You always preferred places where people still recognized each other." A server approached nervously with tea already prepared before Delilah even ordered. Chamomile with honey. Exactly how she used to drink it years ago during late winter meetings. She looked surprised for a moment. "You remembered." "Some people are difficult to forget," the young server admitted softly. Delilah thanked her with a small smile that immediately calmed the girl's nerves. Across the lounge, several younger executives whispered among themselves, trying to piece together who this woman really was. One finally leaned toward Arthur's assistant and quietly asked, "Why is everyone treating her like this?" The assistant looked genuinely confused by the question. "Because half this building would not exist without her." Delilah heard it anyway. Her expression shifted slightly, uncomfortable with praise. Arthur noticed immediately. "You still hate attention. Attention changes people." "Not always." Delilah stirred honey slowly into her tea. "No. But money does. Status does. People begin performing kindness instead of living it." Arthur's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Something happened downstairs. Delilah remained quiet for several seconds before finally answering. "Your manager saw my coat before he saw me." Arthur leaned back slowly in his chair, disappointment settling visibly across his face. Nearby conversations softened again as several staff members overheard the sentence. Delilah noticed immediately and lowered her voice. "Do not fire him." Arthur looked surprised. "Delilah. I mean it." Her eyes stayed fixed on the teacup warming her hands. "If you remove every person capable of bad judgment, eventually you are left with nobody honest enough to improve." Arthur studied her carefully. "Most people in your position would demand consequences." Delilah let out a quiet breath. "That is because most people enjoy humiliation more when they survive it." The sentence landed heavily across the table. Arthur glanced toward the city skyline for a long moment before speaking again. "You know what worries me?" Delilah looked up. The Ashcroft used to attract ordinary people celebrating extraordinary moments. Weddings. Birthdays. Anniversaries. Soldiers returning home. Families saving for years just to spend one weekend here. He paused. "Now everyone seems terrified of not looking wealthy enough." Delilah nodded slowly. "Luxury used to mean comfort." Her fingers traced lightly against the warm ceramic cup. "Now it means intimidation." Silence settled between them while the piano resumed softly near the lounge bar. Downstairs, somewhere far below the rooftop, Grant Ellis was likely still standing in that hallway replaying every word he had said to her. Delilah did not hate him for it. That was what made the moment heavier. Because the people who humiliate others rarely believe they are cruel. They simply believe certain people deserve less warmth than others. Arthur looked at her quietly across the firelight. "You came back tonight for a reason." Delilah smiled faintly toward the bakery boxes resting beside the piano. "I heard the hotel forgot what Christmas tastes like." Snow continued falling over Manhattan long after midnight, soft white flakes drifting past the rooftop windows while the Ashcroft lounge slowly settled into a quieter rhythm. The bakery boxes Delilah brought upstairs had already been opened near the piano bar, and for the first time in years the rooftop smelled faintly of cinnamon, butter, and warm pecans instead of imported perfume and polished leather. Staff members who usually moved through the lounge with rehearsed professionalism now lingered longer than necessary, smiling at each other in ways that felt strangely human again. Marcus played softer at the piano that night. Slower too. Exactly the way Delilah preferred. She sat near the fireplace with her tea growing cold beside her while Arthur Bennett spoke quietly with several executives across the room. Every so often another employee approached her cautiously. A bartender she once helped pay through nursing school. A housekeeper who remembered the winter soup deliveries during the kitchen fire years ago. A valet who admitted his mother still bought birthday pies from Boone's Bakery every November. Delilah listened more than she spoke. That was always her way. Near 1 in the morning, she finally rose to leave. The rooftop had grown quieter by then, the city lights below blurred behind snowfall and fog. Arthur walked her toward the elevator personally despite the ache in his knees. "You could come back properly, you know," he told her softly. Board meetings. Holiday galas. The ownership dinners. Delilah smiled faintly as she wrapped her old knitted scarf around her neck again. "I think the hotel already has enough people trying to look important." Arthur laughed quietly under his breath. But the sadness behind his eyes remained. Things changed after the renovation. Delilah looked toward the lounge one last time. "Buildings change," she said gently. "The question is whether the people inside them still recognize warmth when they see it." Arthur nodded slowly because he understood exactly what she meant. The private elevator carried her back downstairs in silence. When the doors finally opened into the walnut hallway, Grant Ellis was still there waiting alone beneath the amber lights. His tie had been loosened slightly now. The sharp confidence he wore earlier that evening was gone entirely. Delilah stepped out holding her empty bakery boxes while snow boots pressed softly against the carpet. Grant immediately straightened. "Miss Boone," he began quietly. "I wanted to apologize again." Delilah studied him for a long moment. He looked different now. Smaller somehow. Not because he lost authority. Because shame had finally replaced arrogance. "You know," she said softly, "the strange thing about hotels is that people rarely remember the marble floors." Grant lowered his eyes slightly. "They remember how they were treated." "Exactly." Silence settled gently between them. Not hostile anymore. Just honest. Grant swallowed hard. "I think somewhere along the way I forgot that." Delilah adjusted the scarf around her neck. Most places do when they become too concerned with appearances. Near the lobby entrance, the young receptionist looked up nervously as Delilah approached. But this time Delilah smiled at her warmly before walking toward the revolving doors. Outside, the city air felt cold and clean. Snow gathered softly along the sidewalk while taxis rolled through wet streets glowing gold beneath streetlights. Behind the glass walls of the Ashcroft Grand, people still moved through the lobby in expensive coats and polished shoes. But something about the atmosphere felt quieter now. Less performative. As Delilah disappeared slowly into the snowy Manhattan night carrying her empty bakery boxes home, Luis Mendoza watched from the doorway with his hands folded behind his back. Then he looked once toward Grant Ellis standing silently beneath the chandelier light and said the one thing nobody in the building would forget afterward. "The richest feeling a place can give someone," he murmured softly, "is dignity."